Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. Thank you all of you, for being here with us today. I'm Sharon Burke. I'm the president of Ecospherics and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I wanted to welcome you on behalf of Lauren Herzl-Risi, who's the director of the Environmental Change and Security Program. She wasn't able to join us today, although I think she's listening in. So I'm delighted to be moderating this event for her. So from the Bronze Age to the digital economy, minerals and metals have shaped human development for thousands of years. But the urgent transformation that we need to have now in the post-industrial global economy means a very steep demand curve for a whole new class of minerals. So the conversation we're going to have today is a necessary prerequisite to getting the energy transition right. So let me give you an overview of how this event is going to go. I'm going to start us off with a few introductory comments, and then we'll have a chance to hear from two really important key US government leaders from the Biden administration and from Congress. And next, we'll have a presentation on green minerals from the US Agency of International Development, followed by a really great panel from the scholarly, activist, and business communities. We'll leave some time at the end for your questions. And judging from the 700 or more people who pre-registered, our audience today is equally diverse as our panel and equally global. We have panelists joining us from Bangkok and from the Democratic Republic of Congo and from here in Washington, D.C. So this kind of sector and world-spanning dialogue is what I think we've all come to expect from the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is a think tank, and it's based in Washington, D.C., mandated by Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research communities. So the center's home to about 15 different research programs that focus on various regions and topics. And it's wonderful that so many of them are co-sponsoring today's event, which tells you that there's a lot of work going on in this area at the Wilson Center, and each program brings its own expertise to the topic. So the program I'm affiliated with is the Environmental Change and Security Program. Founded 28 years ago, the team works to connect issues at the intersection of environment, health, and security to foreign policy and international development. So ESG, environment, social impact, and governance is at the heart of their research. Everything from the ways communities and countries cooperate or butt heads over access to natural resources, to how climate change and responses to climate change are reshaping everything from local landscapes to geopolitics, and then also to the development of policies that support a more sustainable, just, and prosperous future. That's ECSP. And on behalf of my colleagues from the program, I want to thank the U.S. Agency for International Development for supporting this event today, for putting this conversation in motion, and for being a true partner in laying the groundwork for today's discussion. And that is a perfect segue to our first two speakers. First, we're so fortunate to have the Agency for International Development's Gillian Caldwell here today to give us an opening remarks for the event. She is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for AID, and she also serves as the agency's Climate Change Coordinator. Administrator Caldwell has a long history of innovative leadership at this sort of intersection of human rights and environmental quality, including she was the CEO of Global Witness, among many other important roles. And following Administrator Caldwell's opening remarks, we will welcome Representative Kathy Castor to the spotlight. Now, I can tell you that wave of reformists who were elected to Congress in 2006, they do not disappoint. And Kathy Castor is a perfect example. Representing Florida's 14th Congressional District, Congresswoman Castor has a long track record of protecting the environment and the economy, figuring out how to reconcile those things, and addressing climate change, and especially in her role as chair of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And if you haven't read the Congressional Climate Action Plan that Democratic members put together under Representative Castor's leadership, you really should. It's because it's a great blend of ambition and pragmatism. It's exactly what we need. So with that, I'm delighted to turn things over to Gillian Caldwell, who will be followed immediately by Congresswoman Castor. Gillian, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you to the Wilson Center for partnering with us yet again to organize a terrific event and for really bringing together such a stellar and diverse group of experts to discuss this complicated and critically important topic. I also really want to thank Representative Castor for participating and for your leadership in advancing bold action to tackle the climate crisis, especially your commitment to accelerating the transition to renewable energy, which of course is very much the shadow surrounding this conversation. As chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, your leadership has just been essential to driving the large-scale transition to renewable energy we all want to see, and that organizations like USAID, where I work, are working so hard to support. But we're here today because we have to be clear-eyed about the implications of that transition, and we can and should do more to understand and address the challenges we will be confronting as we make the transition. One of the biggest implications of the renewable energy transition, of course, is the skyrocketing demand for minerals like cobalt, lithium, and nickel that are essential for making the wind turbines and solar panels and electric vehicle batteries that are at the heart of the green energy economy. In fact, demand for some key minerals is projected to increase upwards of 500% by 2050 compared to today's levels. Now, the Biden administration, through Executive Order 14017 on America's supply chains, has made it clear that more secure and resilient supply chains are essential to our national security, our economic security, and achieving our climate goals. But the mining boom really creates such a complex mix of opportunities and challenges, particularly in the fragile states and communities where USAID works. My colleague Kim Thompson will go into more detail on these challenges and opportunities in just a few minutes. But to summarize at the highest level, resource-rich developing countries are under increased influence of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, and other actors that seek to exploit valuable mineral resources at the expense of local communities. Now, on the one hand, lucrative extractive industries can create job opportunities and generate revenue for much needed infrastructural investments in these countries. But all too often, what we actually see on the ground in many of the places where we work as USAID is increased corruption, human rights violations, including forced labor and child labor, environmental destruction, and conflict. USAID has over 20 years of experience working in the minerals sector, establishing ethical and conflict-free supply chains, increasing civil society oversight, improving benefit sharing for local communities, and I think really importantly, supporting implementation of global standards, such as those established under the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI. This is an issue I'm very passionate about. As Sharon mentioned, I used to be the CEO of Global Witness, an organization which has really been at the forefront of collective efforts to push for decisive actions on transparency and accountability and equity for communities who have as much to lose as they have to gain from new mining in their terrain. So now, as Chief Climate Officer of USAID with significant global reach, I know we have potential to do so much more in this area. In our most recent climate strategy that will guide our efforts through 2030, we made an important step towards developing future programs. USAID and the State Department recently submitted a fiscal 23 budget that requests a historic $2.3 billion in international climate funding. And if enacted, that would enable us to support our climate strategy priorities across the board. But we do remain constrained because we don't have any regular or dedicated funding to support our countries in the mineral sector, surprisingly. We're very much hoping to do more, and you'll be hearing more from Kim about what we've already done to deploy the tools and knowledge that we have to help make critical mineral supply chains more resilient and responsible, and to bring the mining sector better in line with America's environmental and social values. I know we're all keen to work together to support a responsible green energy transition, a just transition, empowering communities, promoting equity, transparency, and accountability in global mineral supply chains. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Sharon.
Thank you, Gillian. Congresswoman, if you would give us your keynote remarks, we're ready to hear you.
Great, thanks, Sharon. It's really an honor to be with all of you today, especially Administrator Caldwell, everyone with the Wilson Center Environmental Change and Security Program. And you know, Sharon, I can't help but reflect upon the time we were together in the United States Capitol. One of my favorite days in the Capitol. You attended a joint address for the Congress, but it was our elevator ride with the singer-songwriter Carole King, who we were giving directions to. And when we offered to show her the way, she said, "Where you lead, I will follow anywhere that you tell me to." And I want you all to go and listen to that song after our seminar today, because you are all in a leadership role. I really appreciate the USAID, the Wilson Center, and then all of the academics, the activists, the industry leaders coming together to focus on the opportunity and risks for mining the minerals and resources that we need to power the planet with clean energy. The United States and all of us in the international development community, we have a responsibility to lead the world. And that means protecting workers, protecting communities, protecting human rights, protecting the folks from exploitation. But here's the challenge. The world's top scientists have warned us that we are running out of time, and that we need to slash our emissions in half by 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Which means this decade must be the decade of ambitious climate action. Thankfully, we have the technologies to make it happen, but we need to deploy clean energy in a sustainable and equitable way. Unleashing the clean technologies, as we see here in America, it is an amazing opportunity. An opportunity to create jobs, to lower costs for families, to ensure justice for underserved communities. But boy, is it a challenge as we move through this transformation in how we power our lives. So one of these challenges involves developing the necessary minerals. And we know ramping up clean technologies will require the use of many times more lithium, graphite, cobalt, and other critical minerals. So as we work to deploy the clean energy resources, we've got to pay attention to how we do it, how we mine those minerals. Now, thank you very much for referencing our landmark report out of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. I encourage you all to go there. It's online and it has some summaries, climatecrisis.house.gov. In the report, we had about 700 recommendations for the Congress to solve the climate crisis. And the good news is we have enacted about 200 of those into law, passed another couple hundred through the House, and now through the Biden administration, we are making progress. When it comes to critical minerals, we recommended that the federal government develop a national strategy for securing them in an environmentally, economically, and socially responsible way. But you know, we had a follow-on roundtable with government agencies, and they said even in the United States, we don't have a good idea where those minerals exist. So thankfully, USAID's recent report really does a good job of setting the table for us. We also emphasize the importance of building access to the supply chains for those critical minerals. We recommended ways to make that happen, including investing in research and development to develop substitutes. And I'm very proud to say we are on our way here through passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That new law, signed by President Biden a few months back, invested more than $6 billion in battery material processing and manufacturing, as well as EV battery recycling. The infrastructure law also invested in the U.S. Geological Survey geologic mapping, and minerals research. And it included funding for rare earth elements demonstration projects. And more recently, we've made further investments through the House-passed Bipartisan Innovation Act, which strengthens U.S. economic diplomacy and leadership. That's now in the Senate. Keep your eye on that bill because it has some critical policies in it regarding our supply chains and innovation. So thankfully, again, to the Biden administration, they've been, this has been a major focus of every agency, every department. Immediately after taking office, President Biden signed that important executive order that directed agencies to review the clean energy supply chains, take action to strengthen them. But he knows, I think the president knows, and Secretary Granholm is going to be here in Tampa tomorrow as well. And we're going to talk about how we move forward together, lifting up people, making these important investments, how we do that in an equitable way that lifts everyone, that lifts the economic prospects of everyone. It's clear we need to work domestically and with our foreign partners to develop an interagency, to develop supply chains and interagency working groups. We have the tools to do this responsibly and equitably if we put our focus on it. So I look forward to working with all of you to make that happen, and I look forward to today's conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And since the Wilson Center was kind enough to hand me a soapbox, I'm just going to say to our audience, which we really do have a really big global audience, I hope you see, I know that people, this is a really turbulent time in the United States and that it's on view for everyone to see, but I hope that you see that we have some really good leaders in our legislature and in our executive branch, and these two people, there's a lot to admire here. And Congresswoman, I really appreciate everything you had to say, including, I think it's really important that you and your fellow members of Congress got a $6 billion infrastructure bill out there, because that's how the United States is going to lead the way, is through research and development and innovation. So thank you for highlighting all of that for us. I don't know if you'll be able to stick around for our Q&A, but we'll certainly take the charge and the inspiration you gave us. And Gillian Caldwell, I believe, will be able to stick around a little bit for our Q&A. Is that correct? So with that, what I'd like to do now is turn to our presentation and our panelists. So let me I'm going to introduce our presenter and the panelists as well. We're going to have an opening presentation from the Agency for International Development's Kim Thompson, who's the author of the report that the Congresswoman referred to on green minerals, which is what we're here to talk about. She's Career Foreign Service Environment Officer who specializes in the linkages between natural resources and conflict, with a particular focus on mining. And Kim has a long background in these issues, including service at AID missions in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Thailand. So in honor, after Kim presents to us about the report, we're going to hear some reactions, and they're going to share some of their work from three panelists. And I'm going to introduce them now, and then we'll just go right into the panel. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. So first we have Jewel Lord Nemsing, or Jojo, as he goes by, who is an assistant professor in international development at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, part of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. His current research project is titled Green Industrial Policy in the Age of Rare Minerals, Trans-Regional Comparison of Growth Strategies in Rare Earth Mining. And Jojo, you should know, is an internationally renowned scholar and consultant on these topics. And we're delighted he's joining us from Bangkok, which is really heroic because it's now approaching 3 a.m. there. We are also joined by Alyssa Newman, who is the Responsible Supply Chain Program Manager for Google. She has over 20 years of experience in the energy and environmental sector and has worked in a huge range of corporate social responsibility functions, so private sector, government, and global nonprofits. And it's a really important perspective that she brings to the table. And then joining us from the Democratic Republic of Congo is José Blandine Ongato. José Blandine currently serves as the project manager for the International Labor Organization's Combating Child Labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo's Cobalt Industry, COTECO project in Kolwezi, DRC. So she's an attorney by training, a member of the Colorado Bar Association, and is just a highly respected expert and expected in mining policy and governance. So as I said, this is an amazing panel. We're so happy to have everyone here today. And with that, I would like to give Kim the spotlight and let her present to you on the key points of this wonderful report.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank, Representative Kathy Castor and USAID's Chief Climate Officer Gillian Caldwell for their, unwavering leadership in both advancing climate actions as well as addressing environmental justice issues. It is an absolute honor to be with all of you today. And I do have a presentation to go, some slides to show along with my remarks, which I think will help. So thank you. So USAID recently published a report on mining and the green energy transition out of a growing concern that the world could be inadvertently creating the conditions for a new sort of green resource curse. And a resource curse is sort of it's a well-researched paradox whereby countries with high value natural resources and poor governance tend to experience less economic growth, are less free, and struggle to meet sustainable development goals. And this is all sort of in spite of their rich endowment of natural resources. So as Sharon mentioned, I've spent much of my career with USAID addressing things like blood diamonds or conflict minerals such as gold. While serving as a foreign service officer in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I witnessed a growing interest in a new valuable mineral, cobalt. And everyone suddenly was rushing to mine cobalt. There was a race to get it out of the ground. The sector attracted some unsavory characters, along with more and more concerns over child labor and other challenges in and around some of the mine sites. And then I had the pleasure of meeting with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And there was a talented young researcher who had recently published a report on what they were calling green conflict minerals. And suddenly all of the pieces sort of fell into place. And I realized what I was witnessing in the DRC, to use a particularly apt metaphor, was really just the canary in the coal mine, that the DRC with its massive reserves of cobalt was not the only country to be impacted by this new demand. It was just the first. And the demand for green energy minerals would likely be spreading around the world and would impact developing countries. But where and what minerals should we be watching for? And what challenges should we be prepared to address? And what opportunities might exist? And these are really the questions that this new report from USAID attempts to answer. And next slide, please. And so the problem is really quite simple. As both Representative Castor and Gillian Caldwell both underscored, renewable energy technologies such as wind, solar, electric vehicles are absolutely central to our efforts to meet our climate change objectives. But we can't have any of these things without a steady and reliable supply of minerals. And so I'll refer to these minerals sort of collectively as green energy minerals. But simply put, we need to learn to mine better. We need to learn to mine cleaner, and we need to learn to mine fairer. Next slide, please. So first, just definitionally, I wanted to really quickly get on the same page. There are a number of different categories of minerals that get thrown around a lot. So I just put them up here for clarity. USAID identified 16 minerals, which we believe are the most important sort of towards our transition to a green energy economy. 11 of those 16 overlap with a broader category of minerals called critical minerals. And those are critical minerals that are critical to US national security. That's an official list. So there is no global definition for green energy minerals, but this is what USAID is using. And if you would like to dig into why we identified these 16 minerals, all that information is in the full report. But the main takeaway is most, but not all, of the green energy minerals are also critical minerals. Next slide, please. So this chart shows the projected increase in demand for green energy minerals by 2050 under a 2-degree climate scenario. And I will note that that's a 2-degree scenario and not the more ambitious global target of 1.5 degrees. So even using this more conservative estimate of future demand, it's still estimated that global demand will increase by upwards of 500% for some of these minerals by 2050. So we're talking about 5 times more mining than we have today. Those are huge numbers. And just a quick note about recycling. Mineral recycling can and should be part of the solution. But even if we look at the most hopeful projections for future recycling, we aren't going to be able to meet our demand for minerals without significantly more mining. So this is something that we need to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So this map basically gives us a snapshot of where mining is currently happening for green energy minerals. It highlights USAID presence countries that are among the top 3 global producers for any one of those green energy minerals. And just a note here that this is a USAID report. And so there are developed countries such as Australia that are also major mineral producers, and they are not highlighted here because USAID focuses on developing countries and the challenges around developing countries. And so all of our maps are only going to look at those developing countries. We also looked at USAID countries that have mineral reserves of green energy minerals, and that map would look quite different than the one that's up here. So if you look at mineral reserves, then that includes over 70 USAID presence countries. So most of where USAID works has some reserves of green energy minerals. Next slide, please. I put this one up here really just for fun. It's just a different way to look at the data. It shows countries with the largest number or greatest variety of green energy minerals. And so a darker color indicates a greater variety of green energy minerals. And so it just makes different countries pop out a little bit more. And so those countries might not have the largest reserves, but they have the most different green energy minerals. And so they're also important to look at. And next slide, please. So we attempted to categorize the types of risks that we found associated with mining for green energy minerals in the literature. And there were no big surprises here. The risks that we found are similar to what we see in the broader extractive industry sector. This includes governance-related risks and risks associated with labor and human rights issues, environmental damage and pollution, et cetera. There's only really one category that I think is not intuitive, and that's the last one up there, which has a picture of sort of a money plant. And that is intended to indicate these tensions over local and national benefit sharing that sometimes comes out in green energy minerals. So next slide, please. So this slide shows those same risks that I just showed you before, but associated with the different minerals. And this, of course, is just a snapshot of some of the minerals. All of the minerals could be found in the full report. They are listed. The way we did it is on the left-hand side is the risk that is the most cited in the literature that we found. And so if you look at lithium, for example, that the first icon that you see there is the environment icon. So the sort of the most, the thing that we found the most in the literature was concerns over environmental impacts. And I just wanted to give a little bit of an example of what is not shown in a chart like this. So using lithium as an example, lithium is associated with quite a few risks, and it is currently primarily mined in Australia, Chile, and China. But if we're trying to project into the future, with global demand for lithium projected to increase by nearly 500%, many more developing countries are likely going to choose to exploit their lithium deposits. So in terms of lithium reserves, Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina make up what we call the lithium triangle, which has particularly rich deposits of lithium. Ukraine and Serbia have rich untapped lithium deposits, and both of those have already played a role in conflicts. So analysts have pointed out, for example, that in Ukraine, minerals and natural resource reserves are closely tied to Russia's strategic interest in Ukraine. And in Serbia, there's been some protests over concerns about environmental impacts over lithium mines. So just to give an example of one particular mineral of lithium. And then even beyond that, there are already smaller producers operating in Brazil and Zimbabwe, junior exploration companies in DRC, Mexico, Peru, Mali, Ghana, Kazakhstan, and Namibia. That's just for lithium. So this is all to say that the impacts go far beyond what can be seen in a simple table like this. Next slide, please. And this slide, I wanted to put it up here because I think it does something really nicely. It's a chart from the International Energy Agency that shows which countries currently dominate sourcing and processing of green energy minerals. And I just wanted to point out two things on this slide. One is the outsized role of the People's Republic of China in green energy supply chains, largely on the processing side, but also they play a significant role in the sourcing side as well. And that both processing and sourcing are more concentrated than they are with traditional fossil fuels. So on the top lines, you see the fossil fuels, and you'll just see that they're, the top three producers or processors largely, I don't even think they quite make up at a majority, but they're, the top three producers, they have a good amount, but they're not that much. But if you look further down the list at something like rare earths, China dominates both the supply chain for sourcing as well as processing. And so what that really means is I think there's going to be more global pressure to diversify supply chains and for developing countries to exploit their mineral deposits. The next slide, please. So moving on to solutions. And I think this is where there's good news. Because the good news is this, mining isn't new and the risks really are not novel. But the scale and the scope of the challenges have grown. And the good news is we have a lot of tools at our disposal already, and we know how to manage some of these risks. And so we have some of the tools in our tool belt that we need. We just need to engage, we need to pay attention, and we need to act. And so USAID, for example, has over 20 years of experience, working in the extractive sector. And we know that some things work. We know that we can work with responsible companies to create best practice guidance and follow international standards and due diligence. We know we can work with governments on anti-corruption and international transparency standards, like Administrator Cobalt, mentioned earlier on the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. We can work with civil society to act as watchdogs or to ensure that laws and regulations are being followed. We can work with local communities to improve benefit sharing. These are all things that we have and can do more of. We have done in the past and can do more of. And so the, USAID, like many other USG and multilateral organizations and civil society organizations, we're all trying to get smarter about green energy minerals and be part of the solution. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, I think we still have a lot to learn, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today to continue to share what we've learned and to really listen to other important stakeholders that have so much to share on this topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. You gave us certainly a lot to think about, and I have so many questions, but I would like to first invite our panelists to each give an opening comment, either reaction to the report, but also share what they're doing, because I think they're all doing important pieces of this effort, and it will be great to hear from them. So again, in alphabetical order, I believe we would start with Nem Singh, Professor Nem Singh, but Jojo, I'm just going to call you Jojo. Would you start us off and give us a quick reaction, quick overview of your thoughts?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Good evening from Bangkok. What I'm gonna do is maybe to talk about three things, and then from there we can go a little bit more in more detail as we proceed with the discussion with the other panelists. Maybe I'll start to highlight three sort of core points. One is on the question of what China's impact is in the resource sector, and broadly, what does it mean for the US in this particular context. Second, I'm going to talk about the consuming countries and what's the role of consuming countries in order to really highlight the complexity of the demand and supply of the supply chain. And then third, I want to talk a little bit more specific on the debate within the European Union context, where we're doing a lot of research looking at, the difficulty of looking at mining and recycling and substitution. Okay, so I want to start off by saying that we haven't really had a lot of research looking at the exact impact of China in the resource sector, because we often assume that China wants to access resource, it's going overseas, etc. I think most of the interesting work that I've seen at the moment is, we kind of treat China we should start treating China not just as a producing country, because that's what the report is saying, but also that China is equally a consuming country of the resource. So it's not a lot of countries that have natural resources that can, that they can save these resources for their own domestic industrialization, for its own national security objectives, whilst also being able to pursue a foreign policy to acquire more resources from abroad, because that's the nature of that kind of foreign policy. And this has significant impact in terms of how developing countries are reorientating themselves towards the US and China. So for example, if we just look at the map of where China's resource strategy is going, China's very influential in countries spanning from Brazil, South Africa, Southeast Asia, and several countries in Africa. The presence of China in these countries means that, issues on foreign assistance, issues around mining policy, they're all impacted by the fact that China is offering an alternative for these countries. So it's a very big challenge, I think, for the US, but also for the European Union to enter into these markets and compete with China. So I think it's really important to understand that there's a lot more going on the ground. There's a lot more complex relationship as China enters and as China builds its relationship with these countries that have natural resources. The second consequence of China is what I would call, or what generally would talk about as the China model. The China model essentially is, high levels of state intervention, very strong presence of state enterprises, not just in the resource sector, but also in financing, in different ways in which China is entering these markets. In many countries, there's a whole debate at the moment about reindustrialization. So when we talk about the China model, what it's actually offering is an apparently, an alternative model that is moving away from market mechanisms. And so in particular, in the context of natural resources, resource nationalist policies are everywhere, are sprouting, emerging everywhere in many countries. And this is a development strategy that's becoming more and more common. And this is going to be a challenge for US aid, because if countries want to gain more from their natural resource, arguably that's a social justice question from the point of view of the developing country. But at the same time, because we also need these natural resources, we need to find a balance in which we can pursue a more fair and more level playing field relationship with these countries, whilst also pursuing, more sustainable access to natural resources. The second point I want to raise is the role of consuming countries. In particular, in this context, we're talking about the European Union, Japan, Korea, these industrialized countries. In the research that we're doing, one of the most important things that hasn't been highlighted is the fact that the clean energy transition will demand more from developing countries, but there's no clear recognition of the historic responsibility around climate, on climate change and carbon emissions. And I think that because we're demanding more from developing countries, any discussion on climate justice will be really difficult unless we start to recognize and we start to talk about compensatory policies with developing countries. And so I think it'll be very important to really think about how we can pursue a policy where it recognizes some of the historical responsibility of the European governments, for example, in the extractive industry, but also thinking about what might be the alternative options and policy options that are available for developing countries, because they will ask for more when we start to extract more minerals in these countries. The final point I want to raise is on the issue of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard attitude. In the European Union specifically, there's a general trend in which they see mining as, because of the history of coal mining in particular, mining it has negative social, environmental, economic impacts. But I think we need to recognize that if, let's say, countries like Sweden and Spain and France decides we don't want mining within Europe, within the European territory, what that simply means is we're transferring this responsibility of acquiring these minerals from developing countries. As Kate has already mentioned, these countries will want to extract the mineral because it's a clear source and it's a clear opportunity for growth, for development. So I think at the end of the day, there needs to be it's a quite controversial discussion, but there needs to be a discussion, particularly in the context of the EU, about whether or not new mining projects should be pursued in their own territory. Because if we look at recycling, if we look at substitution, which are the two other policy options, it's not going to be sufficient to meet the demands. And if the demand is going to accelerate, not just in clean energy, but also in military, in defense, rare earth and all these critical minerals will require that we start mining not just in the EU, but also maybe even in the United States. So I'm going to close there, and then I'll see if we can have more discussion in a bit.
Thanks, Jojo. And you laid out questions for other panelists, so hopefully they're gearing up to answer. And I think your last point is really important because even though we're focused on the energy transition, these materials are equally important for defense sector, which is where my background is, but also for information technologies and for the entire digital age. And I think that is a great segue to our next speaker. Alyssa, would you like to offer us a few thoughts here before we turn over to José Blandine?
Sure. Thanks, Sharon. I say in opening, just as we're all here today, it's important now more than ever that we act to address climate change and that we adopt a holistic approach that considers the social and environmental risks of the materials and the human resources needed to achieve a clean energy economy. A truly just energy transition is only possible through collaboration, and that's something that I'm going to speak on a couple of programs that we're doing. And in particular, it has to start at the start of our supply chains with minerals. As referenced by Jillian and Kim, we could see as much as a 500% increase in demand for critical materials. And we will only further exacerbate human rights violations and environmental issues in vulnerable communities if we do not address our collective supply chains within the context of climate change. There's the two collaborations that I'll speak to. One is Congo Power, and one is our digital traceability work. Because Kim also had a picture of 2 miners, I'll also call out some communication work that we did at a gold community. That'll maybe be a bonus for everyone to go visit after our workshop today. We created the Congo Power Alliance, which is part of our strategy to end reliance on raw materials. Energy access rates in rural Congolese communities are just 1%. In January of 2020, the Congolese government announced a bold plan to increase electrification from 9% to 30% in 9 years with renewable energy. We think this is a great opportunity for the global community to support Congolese leaders in this plan. I think, again, for those of us that are on the call, it's hard to imagine a 1% rural electrification rate. Most of the materials, it's a one-way street out of Congo, and I think that represents obvious equity issues. We see deploying renewable energy in upstream mining communities as a way of addressing the social and environmental equity and justice issues, while simultaneously building resilience and reinforcing responsible supply chains. We're working with organizations like Dr. Mukwege's Ponzi Foundation and African Park Network's Garamba National Park to support critical infrastructure that addresses the intersection of clean energy, gender, conservation, and economic opportunity. We're also entering a 3rd phase of our digital traceability work, utilizing an open source interoperable blockchain platform. But this isn't about cryptocurrency. I'm mentioning the word, but that's not why we're doing it. We think that this is about transparency and using the best parts of a digital ledger and blockchain to enable us to connect through the start and the end of the supply chain. We've traced over 600 tons of tin from Peru, DRC, and Rwanda as part of this collaboration. And I'll say, while Kim didn't put tin on the map, which I want to see later, Kim, why tin wasn't called out, we think it's the super glue that holds the world together. I'll say the royal we. Little bits of tin from around the world are holding together the devices and products that are allowing us to stay connected right now, that have enabled us to stay connected in the pandemic. And certainly the little bits of tin connect all of the critical infrastructure, including the EVs and the renewable energy systems that we're going to need to meet climate change. We started with tin, but we're not stopping there. We think that enabling more transparency in materials flows can help us track environmental and social impacts, including CO2 from the very start of our supply chains. With better visibility of data, we can not only see how materials flow, but also more equitably address materials impacts. To this end, we're working really closely with the Responsible Minerals Initiative and the USAID and US State Department's led Public-Private Alliance for Responsible Minerals Trade. And I call out for anyone, those are both multi-stakeholder forums, PPA in particular, and I would welcome anyone on the call to join us. Last, I'll just say the picture that Kim showed of the 2 smiling miners, and I think even of what Jojo talked, it's easy to have a NIMBYism, no mining in my backyard. As an environmentalist, you don't like mining, but we're hypocrites if we don't. And also, it's a really fantastic job for a lot of people that has honor and dignity, and it's needed. Yes, we need responsible mining, and yes, we need recycling. But I'll just call out that we created a VR film, and you can go to that mine site from the comfort of your home. It's called Journey of Gold. Why don't I end there for now? I'll look forward to the panel discussion. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Alyssa. And again, if you lost track, I should have mentioned that Alyssa is with Google. So it's the private sector view, but especially from such an important company. So now I'd like to ask José Blandine Ongaro to talk and give us a really, really interesting point of view. José Blandine, take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for the opportunity to share with the audience the International Labour Organization experience in the cobalt mining in the DRC. I will be talking for what the rising demand of the cobalt means for child labor in the DRC from the perspective of the government and the private sector. And then I will touch on the work of the ILO on the ground here in the provinces of Lualaba and Okatanga. Well, while the world is competing for shares of the DRC cobalt, women, men, and children working in mines in the provinces of Lualaba and Wakatanga are experiencing rampant human rights abuses and extreme poverty. Based on recent estimates, we know that the DRC Copperbelt region where we are is home to about 70% of the world cobalt reserves, as Kim has shown in her report, and also 60% of the world cobalt production, 20% of which originates from artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM. About 60% of households in the cobalt region depend on mining for survival. However, as the sector is not formalized, workers face various human rights challenges, including child labor. While green energy presents a great opportunity for the DRC and hope for child laborers and parents in mining communities, rising demand of cobalt could also exacerbate child labor and human rights abuses in the DRC because of the following reasons. Firstly, with a country poor governance, the mining sector is characterized by high corruption and lack of transparency and accountability in the management of mining revenue and mining licensing processes. Secondly, the rise demand, significant increases in revenue would worsen corruption and poverty. Unemployment, lack of social programs, and protection for children leads to increased illegal mining, with parents and children turning to ASM for survival due to higher cost of living in the mining towns. Further, the mechanization of the sector endangers workers' hope for decent work, freedom of association, bargaining rights, fair and equitable wages, social protection, and safe working conditions. Human rights violations continue while a small group of people benefits from the cobalt boom. Based on my field experience working with the private sector and USAID Tetra Tech CBRMT project on 3Ts and gold in the Great Lakes region, we've found that the government must put in place strong laws and policies and coordinate with key stakeholders at all levels to benefit from these opportunities and foster social and economic development. With profits gained from the cobalt production, the government needs to formalize ASM sector through social dialogue mechanisms, establish poverty reduction programs, and ensure strict application of the revised mining code. Right now, the new amended code in the DRC stipulates that mining companies invest a minimum of 0.3% of their profits in community development. If properly managed, this fund could help with social programs, basic infrastructures, entrepreneurship training, and alternative livelihoods for parents to address the root causes of child labor. As for the private sector, high demand requires an upscaling of production, which entails a greater need for services from national subcontractors as per the new mining legislation. Companies can invest in communities through local content by supporting local small businesses through local small businesses and developing infrastructures as part of corporate social responsibility. Upstream and downstream companies must promote supply chain and human rights due diligence and remediation to encourage responsible mining of cobalt, as well as comply with international best practices, national laws, and policies to protect workers' rights and working conditions. For the past 3 years, I've had the pleasure of managing the ILO Coteco project, which is being funded by the US Department of Labor. Our project works to strengthen the capacity of the DRC government, private sector, both large-scale mining and ASM, workers, and civil society organizations to combat child labor in cobalt mining. We have focused our effort in bolstering legal and policy frameworks, sensitizing key stakeholders and advocacy campaigns, and promoting due diligence and international best practices to enhance private sector engagement in child labor monitoring and remediation in cobalt supply chain. Currently, the ILO is developing, on behalf of the DRC government, a child labor monitoring and remediation system to enhance stakeholders' coordination in addressing child labor in mining supply chains. This system will identify children in mining areas and register them in a database to inform a referral mechanism for the appropriate social reintegration. To be successful, this effort requires the cooperation and alignment of all stakeholders. So we strongly urge coordination between the government and upstream and downstream actors to create sustainable solutions to child labor and cobalt supply chain in the DRC. It is critical that the elimination of child labor, protection of rights at work, and promotion of decent work are incorporated in green energy and climate policy for a fair and just transition. Thank you very much for this opportunity and looking forward for your question.
Thank you, Jose. And I want to give Kim a chance to respond, and I have an opening question for her too. But before I do that, Jose, I want to ask you something, because cobalt is really the heart of the matter. I mean, it is one of the cornerstones of a green energy transition, and it's really important for all these other end uses as well. And it is so concentrated in the DRC. So everything comes to a head there. And I just want to ask you both a simple and a difficult question, which is, you're there with your hands on the problem and the solutions. Are you optimistic? I mean, is this like really sharp demand increase? And, you know, China certainly has a lot of direct investments, has ahead of the curve there. There's going to be a huge amount of competition between nations for DRC's attention and investment. This is going to get harder, not easier. Are you optimistic? I mean, you're right there. You know, what do you see? How do you feel about this?
Thank you very much, Sharon. If I say that there's not a problem, I will underestimate it. Cobalt, of course, is assimilated to DRC. The problem is there, and we are all concerned about rising demand because of a green energy transition, and all the stakeholders, at least the civil society in DRC, is mobilized. They've been discussing, but a lot needs to be done. Just last week, there was a workshop in Kolwezi organized by the Natural Resources Governance Institute, the local branch, to just discover a discussion with local provincial authorities, mining companies, to understand what needs to be done so that the DRC can really profit for this boom, cobalt boom. But we also recognize that because of the competition, the people living in mining communities, children in the region are, kind of left out. A lot needs to be done. The DRC government needs to take control of the situation, because if the new mining code they have achieved a lot, but the applicability of this law is a problem. And the corruption, high corruption, and lack of transparency and accountability is a big problem. With regard to investors, yes, they have a lot of investment coming, but until the government will put order in the way of handling natural resources, especially the cobalt, I don't think we are close to the solution. So people need to get together. All the stakeholders must work together so that we can at least have a fair transition, as I say.
And you think it's possible?
I would not say it's not possible. Where there's a will, everything is possible. So I'm again calling on coordination and collaboration among all the stakeholders. Private sector must be more engaged than they are. Private sector must really be engaged with mining communities, working with civil societies, and also at the regional level, international level, so that we can have a glimpse of hope. But the way things are looking right now, we still a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. That's both encouraging and scary. So just all at the same time, I would say that means you're good at your job. Kim, I want to give you a chance to respond, especially Jojo asked you a very direct question. And I'm going to throw another question at you, and then I'm going to start filtering in questions from the audience because we're getting quite a few. But my question for you, Kim, is that there's a lot of activity in the US government, and also for Administrator Caldwell, if she's on the line, there's a lot of activity in the US government on minerals. The Trump administration had 2 executive orders that are still in effect. The Biden administration released, I think, 7 new plans or statements on February 24th. They're coming from the Department of Defense is changing its stockpile. There's a Defense Production Act, I think $200 million additional just passed. There's a lot of activity going on in this space. And a lot of it focused also on domestic mining in the United States. But your report and AID's role and report talking about environmental and social impact and governance concerns, I haven't heard too many other government agencies really talking about that when it comes to minerals. Do you feel as though your voice is heard in the interagency community? And Administrator Caldwell, I see that you came back on. So if you would like to answer that, please feel free. And then Kim, if you want to talk about your response to the panel, that'd be great. Gillian?
Well, I guess I'm not sure I would agree that the environmental and social impacts aren't under consideration. I mean, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which passed recently and pertains to all solar panels and components produced in Xinjiang, which are presumed to have been produced with forced labor, and requires that they be held at the border. Gets very much at the question of environmental and social impacts. And that law is, under frequent, discussion across the interagency because of its implications. It doesn't apply by its terms to global procurement, but needless to say, nobody wants to be procuring products that are produced with slave labor. So I think the conversation's, fairly live across the interagency. I think the challenge is, we're so far behind the 8 ball when it comes to really stepping up production and producing viable alternative supply chains. I mean, the PRC has really got a lockdown on the market right now, on cobalt especially, but, numerous green minerals. And unfortunately, the U.S. hasn't, I think, invested to the extent it should have to be in the forefront in the context of this transition. So and you can't produce a new supply chain overnight, and you certainly can't compete with slave labor. So the question becomes, unless all governments are going to start to take this slave labor seriously, China will continue to have buyers for its component parts, and that'll make it more difficult to stand up, supply chains that are adhering to labor and environmental standards. So I mean that's my take on it. I think it's a big conundrum, and I don't think it's getting enough focus at a global level. And I think that is because of the pressure everybody is under to transition to renewable energies, and people know that if we do double down on these environmental and social safeguards, we're going to struggle to meet all the net zero targets that have been articulated. But I don't know, Kim, you may disagree with me on this.
Kim?
No, I don't disagree at all. I'll add in a couple of additional comments on top of what Gillian just said. So, one, USA does participate in the National Security Council dialogues, and I would argue that one of the US government's biggest strengths is our diversity of opinions going into dialogues like that. That really is the strength of the US government. And so, we've shared this report, of course, with our colleagues within the government, and it has sparked conversations. So, the way I see it is it is very much in line with our goal of securing reliable supply chains. And it's very, very difficult to secure reliable supply chains without addressing the risks that make supply chains sort of unreliable. I mean, you can look at, what you can look around the world and see where supply chains are upended, and it typically is a result of one of these risks. And so if we're going to secure reliable supply chains, we need to be paying attention to these to the risks that are associated with each of the supply chains. And I also wanted to acknowledge Jojo's question, about the People's Republic of China offering, sort of a different development model and competing, on the ground in developing countries. And this is something that certainly we're taking very seriously. And again, I would argue that some of the solutions are the same. It's about promoting transparency and accountability, in things like this extractive sector, so that there aren't two different playing fields, so that there is one level playing field, and that would help with some of those concerns as well. Because there certainly are concerns around, particularly the resource for infrastructure deals that are, backed by the People's Republic of China, in places like the DRC. The DRC government is currently reviewing, a number of those deals because of concerns that they're not, that they might not be benefiting the local communities. So, and the more that we can promote accountability, transparency, international standards, things like that, that should help. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. And I think I'd like to come back to China, but first I have to acknowledge that a lot of our questions are revolving around production at home. And I realize that the Agency for International Development, that the United States is not one of your countries that you cover, but I think it's an important set of questions, including that Jojo raised, which is, is certainly aware of Sweden, for example, that Sweden has a lot of mineral resources that they choose not to develop, but everyone in Sweden has a mobile phone, probably more than one. Same in the United States. We want the benefits of these materials, but we don't necessarily want to produce them at home. I think, one of the questions specifically talked about, what's being done to increase domestic mining, and how is it taking account of, I wanted to make sure I got the question right, culturally sensitive sites, surface and groundwater and land bordering tribal trust lands or in rural areas. And I realize, again, that you don't cover these questions at home within the United States, but they're the same questions that you are covering. And so can this be done? Can we do mining in a way that is attentive to culturally sensitive sites and surface and groundwater and land bordering tribal lands? Because that's not unique to the United States. Can it be done? Let's start with you, Kim, but I think it's a question for everyone. And, Alyssa, for example, as a company that's a consumer of these materials, can this be done in a way that is environmentally, socially, and governance-wise respectful and not destructive?
Thanks, Sharon. I can start off, and I should note that I really can't speak on, as you noted, on what our domestic plans are. USAID really covers international efforts, so I won't even attempt to answer that part of the question.
And I should be specific that was a question from Deborah Kroll at the Arizona Republic, and this, of course, is that is not an idle question in Arizona. There's a very pointed reference there embedded in her question to a particular project that Rio Tinto is engaged in with Resolution Copper. But, not commenting specifically on those domestic projects, but the whole set of issues that can this be done? And especially, can it be done in a way that's competitive with China?
No, I think those are really good questions and important questions. And I think when you ask, can it be done? My answer is it can be done better. Is it going to be done without any impacts? No, but it can be done better. And if you look even at the history of mining, we're already doing better than we were 20 years ago. And so we just need to continue and really ramp up the efforts at thinking through all of the diligently thinking through the risks in advance. Overseas, it's really important to have conversations with local communities and people that are going to be impacted by the sites, making sure that that the private sector understands the concerns of local people, not just the government officials. And I think we've gone a long ways. There's a lot of civil society organizations that have put a lot of time and effort into improving the processes. We have international standards. We have best practice guidance. We have a lot of things that are helping us in that journey. It's definitely not a finished piece at this point. We're still in process. But I definitely think that that it's important for us to continue on that same road and to figure out how to do this better and more responsibly, and working with the most responsible companies, and also raising that playing field, because as you point out, it's also very important to make sure that we can still be competitive. So it's really important to have these international standards being raised at the same time, so that we're all starting from sort of a level playing field. And I'd love to hear also what Alyssa and others have to say.
Yeah, Alyssa, since I posed the question to you, but then after that, Jojo, you've got a point about China that I think we'd all like to hear you make. But Alyssa, can this be done? I mean, or is it just a race to the bottom?
I think it comes back to data transparency and really being clear. I think if any of us were in the boardroom of Exxon and other extractive companies when they're like, oh no, let's just burn it, it's going to be fine. Like we know better now. We can track the data. Not to pick on Exxon or any other extractive, but I think the point, we're all at the table now. We've got better data. We need to look at the environmental and the social impacts. Certainly in the United States, I think I still believe in environmental impact reports and the types of rigorous assessments that are needed for anything to be done, and the voice for stakeholders that represent cultural and other perspectives of what can and should be done on that land. There should be a public discourse. I think there's some entities that have approached us that say, well, land mining is too difficult, we should just mine the sea. And that, I think, we have to look at what we're doing. And this is where I talk with some of my renewables folks as I worked in the solar industry. Just because you're a renewable company doesn't mean you're absolved of doing your due diligence in your supply chain. I've been at events where they're not thinking about and reinforcing that they need to do due diligence and make sure that the cobalt that's coming into their products and the lithium is from a conformant source. There are standards, and Jojo spoke to it a little bit too, European and US standards, and we all have to send the same signals. Jose mentioned it as well. We need to send the same signals of what our expectations are, and we have to do that then transparently. I think where we get into problems is where there are different entities that want to move quicker, want to meet a need, take a shortcut, and that's where we get into problems. But I think it can be done. It can only be done if we're tracking the data and sharing the data and looking not just at conflict minerals and assessing conflict. We have to look at conflict minerals with child labor and environmental impacts and CO2, and we have to do that in a way to say, too, if we're mining it here, where are those products being made? Because if we're just shipping and then burning a bunch of CO2 to move the materials, that doesn't make sense. We have to look with, I think, clear eyes and a strong collaboration between public, private sector, academia, and the legislators that all need to be looking at this. So I think it can be done, and we need to just share all the data better.
Does Google use its data and its digital traceability to hold its supply chain accountable?
We do. Well, it's our goal is that we would have digital traceability instead of the industry relies today on a conflict minerals reporting template, and it doesn't include, it includes basic audit level information of conformance, but it doesn't track all the data. Our intention with the work that we're doing with Tim is to enable that kind of tracing with any critical material that's coming into our supply chain.
That's great, and it'll be publicly available.
Yeah,
the information.
yeah.
Okay. Jojo, that's not exactly how China plays this, right? You had a comment about China's impact. You want to say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's two things. One is that when we start looking at China both as a producer and as a consumer of these minerals, we kind of then need to really we need to really look into the way in which the Chinese are shaping, the domestic politics in these countries. As I was saying, for example, in the case of African countries, because there was so little infrastructure in the past, in the 1980s and early 1990s. So when China came in, they really saw China as sort of as a source of finance. But more importantly, particularly in the extractive sector, you can see this agenda of reindustrialization. You can see this agenda of resource nationalism. And all these ideas actually come from the China model. The China model is adding value to the mining industry so that you can add and increase your control over the different aspects of the value chain. But it's also using, let's say, domestic content goals or local content policies. And in many cases, I think these are going to be challenges for resource consuming countries, because if you implement all these policies that are going to increase value, that will increase you'll enable these countries to gain more from the resource. There's going to be impact in terms of the prices of our minerals, but also that we don't, in general, I don't think governments who rely on these minerals want they always see resource nationalistic policies as a risk. So I think it's a challenge, because if we want a fair transition, yes, we want them to gain more value. We want them to increase the mining activities in these countries. But at the same time, it's not something that generally it's not the model that we're used to. I think this is the main challenge. It's like a contradiction on its own.
I think one of the questions we had is getting right at this point. Gerardo Otero from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, which of course is a major producer of critical minerals, asked specifically if China promotes a different type of extractive approach in developing countries to that's traditionally followed by the United States and the EU, which you mentioned, and would it transfer a more integrated approach to extraction and processing on site? So I think he's not talking just about the lateral investment, but also the sort of vertical investment. Is that also what you're talking about?
So is the question to me directly?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's really also very difficult to say that there's one Chinese approach to the different countries that they're working with. But I think in the context of Africa, for example, basically it's the infrastructure that really helped convince African countries to, it enabled African countries basically to have a closer relationship with China. But I think in Latin America, the relationship is really totally different. But I think when it comes to value addition, this is something that a lot of African countries have been wanting to implement, and they have seen this work in China, particularly in the rare earth industry, because the Chinese have been very successful in capturing processing technology, developing refining, and that's actually something that every mining producing country wants in order to add value in their own country.
Okay, fair enough that everybody wants the value, but at the same time, maybe the United States and the EU have something to offer as far as a better way to do this. Gillian, did you have any comments about this competition, the element of competition, and the United States going head to head with China? Any other thoughts on what Jojo had to say?
I mean, I think Jojo has a fair point in that China's obviously offering what appear to be attractive propositions. I think the challenge is that the terms can be usurious and the infrastructure they're building can be decrepit. So, you find people left with the proverbial bill of goods when all is said and done. I mean, I had a meeting with, and I'm not suggesting that Western countries have not impose debt burdens on developing countries. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that I think we all have a responsibility to pursue development and development assistance in ways that are fair and equitable, and to ensure that any infrastructure we provide is well built, is climate resilient, and is fit for purpose. I had a meeting at the last COP in Glasgow with an African country, an administrator power, in which they talked about the fact that 40% of their budget was servicing debt to the PRC. I mean, and I don't think that's unusual on the continent. So that's quite a challenge for a country to navigate.
It is indeed. And I think anybody else who wants to comment on this, feel free to jump in. But José Blandine, we have a specific question for you from Annette Seidenglantz. She said, how is it that children are laboring in this mining? Are parents offering their children, or are children being detained in mining camps? Or is it, relative poverty in the area that causes children to become burdened with taking on family support responsibilities? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing and why it's happening?
Yes, that's a very good question, because it's important to understand the root cause of child labor in order to address it properly. The main cause of child labor, or the presence of children on mine sites, is poverty. But there are other reasons. Some children don't have parents and they have to fight on their own. One of the reasons they find themselves there. And some of them live with grandparents who are unable to provide for their needs, and they are forced to work. And there's also forced labor. Some children who are what we call in ILO slavery, or bondage, they find themselves in mining site. But the main reason is poverty. And in some remote area, because most of minings are there, there is no school, so there's no distraction. And sometimes it's also because there's a big gender issue in artisanal mining. And in Africa, most of the time you find children where you find the mom, and mother has to fight and to make a living for the children. They take the children with them. So as when the child is exposed to artisanal mining at an early age, he will end up doing the same thing for, when he turns 7, 8, or 10, since there's no school in the community. So, but the main reason is poverty. And sometimes because the children don't have any place to go, so they have to fight for themselves to survive.
So minerals are the problem and the answer, right? I mean, it's a big part of economic development for the region. We're almost at time, so I'm going to combine two questions to a last question. One is from Callie Oburn, who said, should an international institution oversee social and environmental impacts from sourcing minerals? How could that empower developing countries and prevent the resource curse? So that's one question, which is, do we have the institutional capacity we need to do better on this, particularly as it's a go sort of economy? And then a follow-up question is from the Union of Concerned Scientists and several other people, do we really need all these minerals? Is there a way to do this, to cap mineral development, or to substitute, or just not need as much? Like, is this a problem that can be solved other ways? So we can go start with whoever's looking at me right now, which would be Kim. So, no, Gillian, go ahead. You raised the hand.
On the second question, I just want to say I think that's a really fair point. And, we need to look more at the principles of a circular economy and about what we can do to recycle existing batteries and other materials. We just have a sort of produce, use, and discard culture globally. And we have planned obsolescence built into technologies, which is a system whereby technologies are intended to be, to fall apart effectively, or to be no longer usable in a short period of time. I mean, that happens across markets. It's a well-documented tactic to grow sales. So I know that Germany is currently considering a bill on recycling batteries, and that looks to the circular economy more broadly. I'm looking forward to getting a hold of that as soon as I can and seeing what we might be able to do to encourage our Congress to pass something similar. But I'll leave the first question to others.
The Congresswoman did say at the top of the event that circular economy and recycling are really important priorities that she's certainly pushing. So I think there's reason to be hopeful there. Anybody else on this question of how do we need less, but also is there a gap in our institutional capacity to manage these issues?
I can start. I can offer a few thoughts, particularly on that first issue.
And feel free to offer closing thoughts too, as you do so. So go ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting question about whether we need an international, an international oversight mechanism or something. I don't know exactly what they're proposing, but I do think we'd have a number of tools which are interesting. So the OECD, for instance, has produced a number of, guidance documents. There's, best practice guidance from, sourcing minerals, for conflict and high risk areas, which a lot of companies use. There seems to be a proliferation of standards now that is coming out because suddenly everyone's paying attention to green energy minerals. And it almost seems to me like we may have too many right now, and there will likely, I think the process will happen naturally in terms of which ones will, the standards that are being developed for cobalt, or the standards that are being developed for, all these other particular minerals, whether or not they can go up to a sort of a higher, more general standard or not. And I don't know the answer yet, but I think part of it is just some time needs to pass. So I don't think the issue is a lack of creating standards sort of from the bottom up. And I also think that there are some places like the OECD, which are natural they naturally sort of hold some of these best practice guidance, which are really helpful. And to have something stronger than that, like we have, for example, in the diamonds space with the Kimberley process, I don't think is necessary in this space for now, but that's a policy issue that I'm sure others are thinking about deeply. But I would just say, just noting that there are a number of standards that gets a little bit technical for a conversation like this, but there are a proliferation of standards out there that are helpful tools. So I think we have a lot of different tools in our toolbox that we can use to improve standards and make sure that the mining that limits the risks of mining as much as possible as we move forward.
Thank you, Kim. And we're almost out of time, but Jojo, you were nodding vigorously. And then Alyssa and Jose, if you have a last comment, we will race to get it all in there.
Yeah, I think I'll be quick. So I think when it comes to the question of the resource curse or resource dependency, my view on this is that this is actually a domestic political process. It's not historically determined. There are many examples of institutional innovation where it has worked. For example, the decentralization efforts in Peru, in order to redistribute the wealth and, in order to minimize the impact, in order to allow the mining communities to have a little bit more benefits from the extractive processes. Brazil has a lot of excellent examples as well in the mining industry in terms of value addition, building technology, etc. So I think the end goal has to be not just to reduce, to nullify the resource curse, but it's really economic and social development. And that should be a more domestic driven process. in terms of the question of do we really need these minerals, I think I want to point out that there's a lot of EU studies that have looked at recycling and substitution, which are the two alternative options they've been looking at. Most of the studies are saying that we can't, that recycling will, even if we complete the full loop, the full circle, it's not going to replace the required minerals that we need. This is the reality of, that's why it's really complex. And so a lot of the policy initiative is really focused on closing the circular economy, but also opening a new conversation about how European countries should rethink their mining policies. And I think this is a conversation that's really difficult, politically controversial, but it's going to have to happen in the next 5 years or so. With respect to substitution, the issue of substitution is that it's mainly driven by the private sector. When companies can't outsource minerals and materials, then they'll find technology to replace it. So I don't think this is an alternative. It's not a policy, so to speak. And so it's really hard to rely on this as well.
Thank you. I think it's a conversation that needs to happen in the United States and DRC and everywhere else too. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but I do want to thank all of our speakers for joining us. And as you can see, I think this is the beginning of a very rich conversation that we will continue to have. You are all excellent. You're all doing important and exciting work. And it was just a real privilege for us to feature it here. And Jose, Blandine, and Jojo in particular, thank you for joining us across vast time zones and for the work that you're doing on the ground. Alyssa, the work you're doing at Google, and Kim for this important report that you're shaping what the US government is doing. So thank you all. And for the Wilson Center, I'm pleased to have been here with you today. Take care, everybody.